am I glad he's frozen in there and that we're out here, and that he's the sheriff, and that we're frozen out here, and that we're in there, and I just remembered we're out here. What I want to know is, where's the caveman?
It's world ranking time once again. If you've watched the Kingdom Hearts 3 video, then you know the idea, and if you haven't, watch that video! What do you think I'm running here? If it has a world title card, then I'm ranking it from worst to best, of course in my humble opinion. Why am I doing KH1 ahead of KH2? Really no reason other than KH1's gameplay is just what I felt like experiencing when the urge came to write another one of these. The worlds here are much smaller than KH3 with generally less to do, so I was expecting this to come out much shorter than that one, but looking at the word count here, it seems like I've actually got nearly as much to say as I did last time. Unlike last time though, the stakes are a little bit higher for each world here. On average, each world in KH3 had so much going on in terms of story, gameplay, or both, that a world with notable flaws could still afford to get pretty high on the list if its merits compensated. In this video, a world could be elevated by just one particularly great cutscene, or stymied by just one particularly frustrating gameplay section. I imagine there will be plenty of different opinions on this one, so give me your own world ranking in the comments, and without further ado, let's get it on! This will be a much more favorable opening entry than the last list, and I think this is a perfect early example of just how differently I'm approaching this list compared to the previous. I think purely in terms of the experience of playing it, this is absolutely a worse world than something like Arendelle, the second to last placement on the KH3 list. That being said, while Arendelle's entry was a long-winded rant dripping with malaise over missed potential for something great, Atlantica is, by contrast, probably going to read a lot calmer and less bothered, because its problems have less to do with story and more to do with a general sense of dated KH1 specific jank in the gameplay. It is some pretty bad jank though. This is the only world in the game that I actively dread hitting on every playthrough, which is a bit of a silly thing to feel since it's one of the worlds that's completely optional if you're just trying to finish the main story. What can I say, I'm the kind of KH player who doesn't really like to skip worlds on a given playthrough, and for the purposes of this video, Atlantica obviously couldn't be avoided. Granted, if I might offset that, for all the dread that I feel, the world is never quite as bad as I go into it expecting. It's perfectly playable. The underwater traversal and combat isn't exactly torturous, but it's hardly convenient. If nothing else, getting to always travel in 3 dimensions makes for a unique experience among the rest of the game, and what's actually most annoying once you've acclimated to the swimming is just how most of your abilities don't carry over. Underwater combat is the most tedious since it never goes beyond a single basic combo and spells, which ends up making Atlantica the single world where I'm most likely to avoid combat. But the real problem here is that Atlantica doesn't give you a ton of direction for how to actually make things happen in it. This is true of all the worlds in KH1 in a way that it's not for any future entries. KH1 is the game least likely to hold your hand as far as letting you know how to progress the story of each world, and if you'll pardon the pun, Atlantica is for sure the one which leaves you most adrift. The best you'll get as far as direction is stuff like Flounder telling you to play with the big fish, which is meant to translate to ride the dolphin in a circle, then get off and go to a different room where the dolphin will reappear, then you can ride him again to the sunken ship, which you then have to enter to make the story go forward. Or how there's a bit where a cutscene ends with Sebastian saying he's coming with your party, which is your one and only hint to take Sebastian with you to the sunken ship so you can unlock the entrance to Ursula's lair. That kind of very vague hinting happens a couple times, and it makes actually getting through the story here kind of a chore. Speaking of said ship, I do like the way the game manages a genuine jump scare by recreating the bit with the shark from the movie. Another super unsettling thing is the way that Ursula's little shriveled victim things stare you down as you enter her lair. Speaking of Ursula, her first boss fight is pretty fun and interesting, what with the mechanic of firing spells at the cauldron to stun her. That said, her big giant phase is a lot less fun, and it's a shame that she doesn't have a ton of presence in cutscenes, meaning she doesn't get to ham it up the same way that the other villain council members do. Pat Carroll is definitely the most underutilized of all the Disney villain actors in the game, which is a shame for such a famously boisterous character. Story-wise, Triton is a fun wrinkle. It's rare we get Disney characters who aren't outright villains who oppose Sora's presence in their world, and the implication that he's familiar with Keyblade warriors and their general MO makes for one of those great never-to-be-solved KH mysteries. What really stuck out to me though is this shot at the end of that scene, where Sora really seems to internalize Triton's words and looks at the Keyblade for the first time as though it might be more of a liability here than it is a help. It's a quick little character beat that's never really followed up on, but I find it so interesting. Personally, I think later games should take a note out of this world's book and attempt Disney worlds that take this idea further by having Sora's mere presence be a genuine source of conflict. In getting the people close to her hurt through her desire to explore other worlds, and then working to redeem herself for that foul-up, Ariel makes an interesting parallel or foreshadowing to Riku's journey. I wish there was more done with that, but like a lot of the more straightforward, semi-adaptational Disney worlds, this is one where Sora, Donald, and Goofy's role in cutscenes is pretty passive. That our main trio doesn't actually have a ton to do is probably reason number one with a bullet that this world lands lower than an upcoming entry. Without spoiling anything, another world that's fairly low on the list at least seems a bit more invested in our leads, whereas here they're very much just player vessels. As battle themes go, an adventure in Atlantica is... it's alright, it's fun, it's bouncy, but when paired with Under the Sea as the general world theme, I think it's appropriate for the setting without being to my taste. If nothing else, I give the world points for committing to its bit and executing it in a way that could have certainly been a lot worse on the PS2. This was originally going to be the bottom entry, but I ultimately put it above Atlantica not just because of that world's weaknesses, but because of this one's biggest strength, namely its pure, unfiltered charm. Granted, while it can't be helped that 100 Acre Wood is much better here than in KH3, it's still a world where you don't fight any Heartless at all, no story progression takes place, and though the gameplay is much more varied here than it is in 3, it's still just a bunch of minigames that really only approach fun, and by extension more often than not fall into the valley of frustrating or tedious or perfunctory. I don't want to undersell it completely though. The entire point of the world is having a place to slow down and just enjoy some lighthearted shenanigans without any drama or Heartless in sight. And with more gameplay variety, story, and exploration to work with than its KH3 counterpart, that appeal is really allowed to settle in. If absolutely nothing else, I'm compelled to help gather the pages so Pooh can reunite with his friends, and I feel a genuine sense of accomplishment having reunited them all by the end. Aside from that, getting to explore more than one room leads to just a whole bunch of adorable little things to interact and mess with. Most memorable of which for me is how you can utterly decimate Rabbit's garden for items if you feel like it. Seriously, I could not believe the game was just letting me tear this poor guy's pride and joy out of the ground like a complete sociopath. The 100 Acre Wood theme and Bouncerama are also both incredibly charming musical pieces. I wish I had a bit more to say, but it's just a sweet little reprieve of a world. I'm tempted to describe this as the entry that exemplifies how one really bad sequence can drag a world down, but if we're being honest, this is really a broader case of a whole world being kinda meh from a gameplay perspective. I kinda wonder if part of the issue might be that it's another world that's deceptively difficult to make super interesting in a video game. Tarzan is one of those movies that I think has become more and more forgotten with time, likely due to the Edgar Rice Burroughs estate stopping Disney from calling back to it much, but personally I think it's an incredibly strong movie, probably my favorite of the Renaissance era next to Hunchback of Notre Dame, and it's a shame that despite its strengths, an African jungle makes for one of the more generic, nondescript locales in this series. There is something really cool about exploring locations like the camp and the treehouse, because that's iconography that's more specific to the movie, but that's ultimately just two rooms surrounded by trees and bamboo. I mean, you can do a cool little tree slide with Tarzan if you feel like getting smacked in the face multiple times. Generic ends up unfortunately describing a lot about Deep Jungle. This world is the introduction to party members besides Donald and Goofy, and it's a shame then that Tarzan himself doesn't leave much of an impression. That's largely due to the massive language barrier between he and the rest of the cast, but on top of that, Tarzan is one of those Disney protagonists I mentioned in the previous video, whose character arc from his source material is completely omitted. Without the angle that Tarzan is torn between loyalty to the apes he was raised by and newly discovered members of his own species, there's just not any actual character to work with to make his presence remotely memorable. Tarzan does a lot of vague speaking to the power of friendship and hearts, which is relevant thematically, but how cool would it have been to have some more scenes where he butts heads with Kerchak, and have Sora play as much of a role as Jane does in proving that not all humans are like Clayton? I don't know, the more I think about it, the more this game in general doesn't really give much in the way of meaningful character work for party members who aren't Ariel or Beast, but it really sticks out just how little Tarzan contributes to his own story here. Like, at least Aladdin and Jack Skellington have some of their unique character bleed through in cutscenes. Without his inner turmoil over nature versus nurture to lend him depth and angst, or fascination with human culture present to give him some levity, Tarzan is just kind of a basic guy. Maybe that's all a side effect of the game choosing this world to focus some on the Sora-Donald-Goofy dynamic, which is admittedly a smart choice. Sora's relationship with D&G really solidifies itself here, and I like that a lot, though more on paper than in execution. I feel like I'd have stretched things out a bit by having the trio separated for longer. In tandem with allowing Sora to develop a real dynamic with Tarzan, you could make Sora and the player really miss Donald and Goofy by encountering something like a really tough boss or wave of enemies, and let their absence be felt in the story, so it lands extra hard when the gang reunites. Through Clayton, this is the first inkling that we get of how someone can lose their heart to their own inner darkness. And that being the prompt for Sora and Donald to forgive each other and restart their relationship on a stronger foundation should really be given more heft. This world's ending cutscene is the planting that will eventually pay off with the iconic "my friends are my power" bit later in the game, and I do like that it's comparatively subtle in having Donald and Sora realize that they'll have to really open up to and lean on each other if they want to remain the best of themselves. It's a nice little story beat I still believe could be given something extra, you know? Speaking of the duck though, there's a little character beat that I like in this world that I've never seen discussed, and that's Donald saving Turk from Clayton. Up to this point in the game, Donald's made a big deal about not meddling in the affairs of natives in any given world, and he only helps out an innocent party at Sora's behest. His single-minded desire to find Mickey is what got the trio in this deep jungle pickle in the first place, so it's interesting that here is the first time we see him do something completely selfless and unprompted that's actively interfering in native affairs. It's the first real sign that Sora and Donald have way more in common than just an alliance of convenience. I'll say it is weird to have Turk, Kerchak, and Kala here but not give any of them any dialogue. And also no Tantor, what's up with that? Jane was able to learn to speak Gorilla, I'm sure Sora could too. Really, this world suffers more than most as far as how the format of this game truncates the Disney stories. Tarzan, Tantor, Turk, Kala, the Professor, and Jane are all really endearing characters in the movie, Jane especially, and it's a shame that none of their personalities really come through here, if they even made it in at all. Clayton comes off a bit better, if for no other reason than Brian Blessed always brings peak ham, but aside from the fact it never gets to appear again in the series, I think what makes this world unmemorable for so many is that the cast doesn't really get to leave an impression. I talk about how the camp is a room that I like, and a lot of that is little things to do around the place, like collecting slides or somehow using Jane's stove and chemistry set to cook potions into high potions or replicate items. It's really interesting, and it feels like the nascent baby version of deeper mechanics from later games in the series. Speaking of those slides, the first reveal of Bastion in the slideshow is really effective. This imposing castle that the player's not seen before, but which Sora still faintly recognizes, is one of the more explicit bits of plot foreshadowing in these early worlds, and it's a great optional moment. Getting back to the gameplay, I've got to address the elephant in the room. Oh wait, Tantor's not here. I gotta address the hippo in the room. The vines are annoying. Like, really annoying. Really annoying. It's basically a mandatory minigame, and it's so irritating that it drags the entire world down. The number of times that I have exactly one jump to make before I could finally be rid of this section and progress the story, only to fall back down and have to do the entire thing over again because of some quirk of the game's camera is More than 0, which is unacceptable. It's a real shame because part of the charm of KH1 is how it's one of only like 2 games in the series that's remotely interested in being a platform game where jumping around and precise navigation is a meaningful part of exploring the environment. But it's sections like these that are probably the reason that later games never attempted that again. No exaggeration, this held me up for over an hour of gameplay as I went through the world to make this list. The tree slide would be about as frustrating if it wasn't both incredibly short and completely optional. The vines are something the story absolutely requires you to do at least 3 times, which will probably translate to about 78 separate attempts. Maybe in a world that had more fun and memorable sequences, characters, or rooms besides, I'd be more forgiving. But here, this level of jank has rightly given this world a really poor reputation among fans. When you make a list like this, there's always one entry that makes you feel a little bad, cause it's not really low enough to be a condemnation, but it's just low enough that it feels a bit dismissive. Sometimes it just can't be helped though, and in this case I'd say it's a case of a world not doing enough to really stand out too much. Agrabah is a section of the game that does a lot of things solid, but does no particular thing great. It's got a solid story, is solid aesthetically, Aladdin is a solid party member, and the world doesn't really have anything mechanically noteworthy for good or ill. What really makes it interesting is how it exists in the context of the KH story. I love the opening cutscene of this world between Jafar and Maleficent. It's one of the few interactions we get between Disney characters from different properties outside of Donald and Goofy, and seeing these two ham it up together is great. That said, it always threw me off that we jumped straight from that scene to gameplay with not even an establishing shot of Sora, Donald, and Goofy taking in this new world. I briefly mentioned this in my KH3 world rankings, but it's interesting to me how, in choosing to center this world around Maleficent's wider plans, Agrabah ends up being a retelling of Aladdin without any of the things that are actually pivotal to that film. Like Deep Jungle, it's an adaptation of a love story where the romance is barely alluded to. Jafar's goals here are entirely in service of Maleficent having already deposed the Sultan, achieving his goal from the film entirely off-screen. Neither of Aladdin's first 2 wishes correlate with anything in the film either. To borrow a phrase from the channel which inspired these videos, Agrabah is more like a KH original world in Disney clothing than anything else. It ends up being one of the few Disney worlds whose entire plot is ultimately about furthering the game's central narrative, with Aladdin himself here just being along for the ride because his crush happened to be the MacGuffin. By which I mean the player was ultimately going to have incentive to stop Jafar and save Jasmine even if Aladdin didn't exist. Here, it's the Disney party member who's volunteering to help Sora, Donald, and Goofy rather than the trio assisting with a conflict they're outsiders to because Heartless happened to be involved. This isn't really unique to Kingdom Hearts, but I can't possibly think of another time where it would ever be relevant for me to say this, so let it be on the record here. I never cared for Dan Castellaneta's voice as the genie. Frankly, it just never sounded remotely close to Robin Williams for me. It feels like I'm watching a different character than the guy we saw in the movie, which in the context of the game is a minus. That said, this world story has a lot of great genie facial expressions. Also, hey, let me tell you that you can totally see the save point in the background of Genie's self-made introduction, and then just try to focus on anything but that for the entire cutscene. Believe me, you will fail. Pot Centipede is notable as a boss because it does this really cool thing where, up to that point, the town had been very clearly segmented, with barriers between the plaza, the alley, and Main Street. But then when the fight happens, you and Pot Centipede can chase each other all around each area with no barriers or even loading between the different rooms. I don't know, that's such a cool, subtle way of adding a sense of scale to an otherwise unremarkable boss fight. The other big boss fights are all against Disney characters, which immediately earns them points in my book. And that's fighting the Cave of Wonders, Jafar and Genie, and then Jafar as a genie. I can totally imagine the kind of mind that would look at the extremely limited screen time that the Cave of Wonders has in the movie and be inspired by that alone to make it into a video game boss fight. The fight itself is unique enough by the standards of the game. It's giving baby's first scalable giant fight. The fight against Genie and Wizard Jafar is probably my favorite boss of the 4 in the world though, and that's mainly just on how fun the gimmick is. Chasing Jafar around while Genie very reluctantly throws meager punches and tail whips, covering his eyes, calling his attacks well in advance so you'll get out of the way, and making sure that if he does hit you it produces a ton of health orbs or magic spheres, that's just incredibly funny to me. And I like that for as goofy as it is, Genie's still a genuine factor in the fight that you need to keep an eye on. Get too careless and forget that he's there when your health is low like I did, and he might actually be the thing that takes you out. Last note about this fight, I really like that the keyhole is a part of the boss arena. At this point, we've firmly established the keyhole as the endpoint of each world, so having Agrabahs just stare you in the face as you fight Jafar like a reminder of what the reward is for getting this last guy out of your way is a nice design choice which a later world in the game will utilize to the same effect on a much bigger scale. The real final boss, Genie Jafar, is frankly pathetic. And I don't just mean the fact that you win by wailing on Iago, who barely makes any effort at all to avoid you. I mean Jafar himself, who despite being a big, powerful, intimidating genie, will get sissy slapped on the wrist one time and then spend the next million years rubbing his arm like you personally gave it a hairline fracture. It's an incredibly obligatory feeling boss. In opposite to the Tiger Head, which felt born of genuine inspiration from something in the movie, Genie Jafar feels like something the game had to do because that's how the movie ended, with no one really having any clue how to make it work as a fight. Agrabah also gets plus points for being the world in which you fight Kurtziza, a truly wonderful and challenging secret boss. Getting off the subject of bosses, the Cave of Wonders itself comes so close to being a fun series of puzzles, but never quite gets there. I like that with comparatively little to go on from the movie for the cave's interior, the game commits to it as this trap-laden Indiana Jones type beat with hazards that would hinder either the heroes or the Heartless if either party isn't careful. Had they leaned into it harder, it's the kind of idea that feels like it would have elevated the rest of the world. But as it stands now, Agrabah is just pretty good. Yeah, putting this one in the same cluster as Agrabah and Deep Jungle feels right. It's another world that's kinda straightforward narratively and which feels like a big disservice to its movie, and like Deep Jungle, it's notorious for particularly frustrating gameplay sections. But what pushes Monstro higher than the other two is the focus on Sora and Riku's relationship. Monstrous Monstro is also my favorite battle theme in all of the Disney worlds, so there's that. Getting to fight Parasite Cage alongside Riku is great, and man, in writing this list, I realized just how interesting an approach KH1 took with its boss fights, with almost every world having at least one really uniquely set up boss encounter that feels totally distinct. Granted, the cool factor of the Riku team-up is a little undercut by the fact that I don't think I saw him land one bit of actual damage on the thing. Monstro himself is a notoriously frustrating beast to navigate if you're on a blind playthrough or are playing for the first time in a while. I guess by the time of playing through him for this list, I've just acclimated because I managed to avoid spending hours making donuts and whale intestines the way I have in the past. Although, you know, part of me thinks that maybe you're meant to get lost in Monstro, because if you do know where you're going, it's one of the game's shorter worlds. Especially if you choose not to worry about chests or fighting every enemy that comes your way and just move from room to room in order to progress the story. If you do that, I'm pretty sure you can complete it or at least reach Parasite Cage in no time flat. Not sure why you would ignore the chests though, since that means leaving like 9 Dalmatian puppies behind, and you're not a monster, are you? The fact that Pinocchio, the ostensible Disney guest star of the world, goes through most of it with almost no dialogue is a really weird choice. I get you don't want shenanigans with this goofy wooden kid interjecting in the middle of Sora and Riku's escalating interpersonal tension, but in a world with such little plot, I think you could have padded things out by giving Pinocchio his own little side story or character arc running adjacent to, but separate from, the Riku stuff. Here's an idea: make this world a better adaptation of the movie by having Pinocchio actively looking for Geppetto inside Monstro. Pinocchio's on a rescue mission, and Sora, Donald, and Goofy volunteer to help. That way, instead of the kind of baseless claim that Sora's more concerned with running around and showing off the Keyblade than he is with helping Kairi, Riku actually has more of a leg to stand on in terms of Sora putting Kairi aside for whatever problem relative strangers place in front of his nose. Not only is that more substantive, but it's also true to Sora's character. On multiple occasions at this point in the game, Sora has set his long-term goal of finding Kairi and Riku aside in order to help others, and it would be good to see Riku's understandable rage at that come from a more natural place, while also clashing with something that is objectively altruistic and selfless, like helping this little boy rescue his father. Funny little anecdote about this world, on one of my earlier playthroughs of this game, I had been so dazed and frustrated over getting endlessly lost that in my rush to move on with the story, my mind just kinda blanked for a minute and I went back to the gummy ship after the scene where Riku kidnaps Pinocchio, having somehow subconsciously convinced myself that I'd done all there was to do here. I think maybe I'd assumed that the kidnapping of Pinocchio was something that I'd resolve later in the game, like the kidnappings of Alice and Jasmine, so I actually ended up leaving Monstro unfinished until I was circling back over my progress a dozen hours of game time later, and realized I never finished. This means I ended up getting the final batch of cutscenes in this world after I completed Neverland, which was a bizarre experience, given that Monstro's final cutscene is all about setting Neverland up with Riku on Hook's ship. It also meant that I went through most of the game without the ability to high jump or summon Dumbo. I can't recall ever hearing anyone else do anything similar on their own playthroughs of this game, but let me know in the comments if you ever made a similar bungle. Anyway, speaking of that ship, putting this world right above Monstro feels appropriate since the events on this pirate ship ostensibly serve as a sequel to the events in that whale. Neverland is the world where Riku's turn to the dark side is fully cemented and where we get a clearer picture of what's going on with Kairi. What holds this world back some is that I don't find the ship itself to be a very interesting locale at all. You watch any version of Peter Pan and the intended effect is a sense of freedom and wonder and exoticism, and I can't quite think of a worse way to translate that into video game form than being stuck in a series of cramped brown rooms. On every playthrough, both Neverland and Monstro end up feeling to me like the Disney worlds where the least happens, and yes, that somehow includes 100 Acre Wood. Offsetting that feeling is the fact that what does happen here is pretty nifty. Captain Hook is plenty entertaining as yet another villainous ham, and I've said the word ham a lot in this video and it just makes me want a ham and egg sandwich. Anyway, Hook also makes for a great boss fight that's full of goofy personality. Learning to fly is super cool and empowering. We get You're Stupid.
You're stupid!
And I don't know why, but I find Tinkerbell straight up kicking Donald in the face so laugh out loud hilarious. Even funnier is that Peter Pan absolutely refuses to walk anywhere. The dude flies, even if the ceiling is at like 5 feet, it's a riot. I also love the callback to the film with him doing a perfect impersonation of Smee and poking Hook in the hindquarters. On a more serious note, it's great to see Sora get the chance to physically check in on Kairi finally. That little moment in the brig where an otherwise catatonic Kairi reaches out when she hears Sora's voice is great, both on the level of adorable babies in love and the level of foreshadowing where Kairi's heart actually is. I also think Shadow/Anti-Sora is a really interesting symbol for where Riku and Sora's relationship is at in this world. And yeah, I know Shadow Sora and Anti-Sora are technically two different Heartless, but that's stupid. You're stupid.
You're stupid!
The idea that Riku is aimlessly looking for Kairi's heart and that what he'd want most from Sora in this situation is to be another heartless puppet who listens to him unconditionally. I don't know, I feel like there's something there. At the root of a lot of Riku's screw-ups in this game is the notion that he likes Kairi and Sora both being dependent on him as their leader. And I like that an animated symbol of that sense of entitlement over Sora pesters you all throughout the ship. Big Ben's mainly noteworthy for being the locale where you fight the Reaper, which I won't comment on beyond saying I've never once managed to beat the thing. It's also hilarious to me just how short Sora is compared to Wendy Darling. Like, she's taller than Goofy. That just feels very wrong. Pirates Geek is a battle theme that's really grown on me. I used to hate playing this song on Melody of Memory, but now I'm really able to jam to it. It's one of many cool garnishes that ends up elevating a world that frankly isn't as fun to play and traverse through as it could be. And if you disagree with that, you're stupid!
You're stupid!
So let's say you're developing your big Disney-branded JRPG game and are probably starting to realize that with all of the literal and figurative darkness, entire worlds disappearing, and largely unfamiliar locations, you might be at risk of giving your target demographic nightmares just a couple of hours into the game. What better way to offset that than with a candy-colored world of comparatively low stakes? Enter Wonderland. Believe it or not, this is the placement that I've most fought with myself on. The main reason for that is that a lot of what I'm about to say in its favor has way more to do with concept than it does execution. There's a part of me that contemplates if the Wonderland setting would have worked better as a late game world, largely because it and its inhabitants are so bizarre that you'd want to get a feel for the other Disney worlds first, so you have a somewhat straightforward point of comparison. You got trees and stumps that talk to you when you hit them with a keyblade, flowers that randomly cough up rocks, and the Cheshire Cat as your guide to the place, rambling about stuff you've never heard of if you're not already familiar with the story, like what the heck is a Momrath? That said, I don't think that part of myself is likely to win out, because from a story perspective, I really like what Wonderland offers as an early game world. Ideally, this world is the first that you'd visit on any playthrough, and it's a nice little primer to acclimate to the game's formula. No one's really in all that much danger here. Like, sure, the Queen of Hearts threatens to cut off Alice's head, but she's such a total goober, and Alice reacts to the sham trial like it's a minor inconvenience at worst. That Sora feels so compelled to mount a rescue for this total stranger regardless tells us a lot about him as a character. And this quaint, colorful setting keeps the tone light and friendly until Alice gets kidnapped, which even then is only the barest of gestures toward the bigger picture. I feel like that kinda undersells it, actually. Alice being whisked away at the end of the story to parts unknown is a really great little plot choice. Not only is it the first indication that the Disney worlds might deviate from the movies in unexpected ways, but it tells you that even if one of these starts with a very episodic setup, even those threads may only get tied up at the end of the game. As for the actual meat of the story, maybe this is just because it's an early world and they didn't want to make things too difficult or unfair, but all the incentives the game gives you to actually go hunting for clues are pretty superfluous in the grand scheme of things. The immediate reward for finding all 4 clues is getting the Blizzard spell, but you can also get it by just completing the world. Another benefit of having all the clues is that you can avoid either Donald or Goofy or both being found guilty and subsequently locked up for the following battle against the card soldiers. But even that doesn't accomplish much, since all it takes to bust either of them out of the hoosegow and get them back in the fight is a couple of Keyblade combos. That said, I really admire the idea of all these elements. It's ultimately really low stakes, but it makes the gameplay of the world feel unique, and this early in, even low stakes punishments still register as a fun spin on what could have otherwise been a very straightforward and unmemorable scavenger hunt. In most practical terms, it feels like the whole trial is mainly here to prime you for all the ways that environments can be interacted with through the rest of the game. Wonderland is so full of odd little unintuitive operations and errands you can do to get items or access to other rooms, and it avoids being annoying like Atlantica because none of the weirder stuff is at all necessary to get through the storyline. Going back to that card fight for a second, I love that you can knock the Queen of Hearts on her bloomers if you choose to, should her incessant shouting of prove to be too grating, but also that you conversely risk getting some slight damage from her. I really love To Our Surprise as a battle theme, and Welcome to Wonderland is also a really charming world theme. Honestly, the biggest shame here is that they weren't able to incorporate any of the other movie characters. I guess you could say that the flowers asking for potions and ethers are meant to stand in for the catty flower patch Alice runs into, but it would have been so fun to have scenes with the Caterpillar or especially the Mad Hatter and March Hare. Leaning into the wacky exploration still feels like it clashes a bit with the bare-bone story and candy-coated aesthetic, all of which read as a very clear attempt at crafting Baby's first Disney World, but as Baby's first Disney World, I think it functions really cleverly. I expect I might get some flack for admitting this, but the rest of this script was basically approaching completion before I even realized that I'd not bothered to write an entry for Destiny Islands. Which is insane! Not only is it the first world in the game and the home of our main characters, it's iconic to the franchise and the world which appears most often throughout the series, even if it's just in cutscenes. The only excuse I could possibly think to have is that this world is the only one in the entire game that you can't revisit at all without just straight up starting a new file. So that initial 2-ish hours spent on it is going to be your only exposure to the game and what will more than likely amount to less than 5% of your total playtime. Although, the impression that Destiny Islands makes in that 2-ish hours is pretty solid. It's a very pretty, vibrant little island with a nice little jingle of a world theme, and it's an incredibly low-stakes affair to start. The dynamic of Sora, Kairi, and Riku perfectly captures the vibe of when you and your best friends would talk about running away from home and living off the land at 7 years old. Whether you know where the game is going or not, it's all very cute and quaint, with these kids planning to leave their entire world behind with a raft, some eggs, a coconut, and a mushroom. Combine that with how all the combat here takes the form of literal play fighting and the big-time Stranger Danger vibes of Sora meeting Ansem for the first time, and it all just adds up to this quintessential feeling of innocence that gets dashed when the Heartless invade. The switch up once the island starts tearing itself apart and Heartless comes spilling out of every orifice is nuts. The helplessness of being unable to harm the Heartless with your wooden sword is some great ludonarrative cohesion, as is the fact that even once you get the Keyblade, that feeling of empowerment only goes so far when you realize the island is crawling with an infinite number of the creepy little buggers. For an enemy commonly acknowledged as weak and cute, it can't be understated how actually off-putting, borderline scary the Shadow Heartless are when utilized effectively in these early parts of the game. Prior to all that though, the calmer stretch of Destiny Islands is good for acclimating you to the kind of exploration the game will require afterward. And getting some early Final Fantasy flavor with Selphie, Tidus, and Waka is an interesting diversion. And yes, I know you're supposed to pronounce it Tidus, but I'm not doing that. Tidus rolls off the tongue way better. You also get to fight Riku and race Riku, both of which you could conceivably win if you're skilled enough, but are very much designed with the idea in mind that Sora's the underdog who will spend most of the rest of the game trying to catch up to his rival. It's notoriously frustrating, but also a great way to get the player to want Riku taken down a peg early on. Although Riku clearly having abilities like guard and high jump unlocked already is obviously some kind of cheating. The whole Sora, Riku, Kairi dynamic all starts here, and the cutscenes of this world do a great job getting you to care about this friendship, / maybe possibly almost potential love triangle. You get endeared to these three just enough that you want them reunited as badly as Sora does, or at least badly enough that that motivation can carry you through to the moment the rest of the game's stakes get revealed. It's all good stuff. Between this video and the last one, I've talked a fair bit about how certain Disney movies were probably harder to adapt than others as far as character and story. But you know what I've not given much thought to until now? Just how much a Kingdom Hearts translation can also impact a Disney movie's general vibe and style. And I don't know if there's a bigger exemplar of this than Olympus. It's always a little surprising to go back to Hercules the movie and remember just how much of a zany, wacky, borderline farce it is. Most Disney movies aim to be some kind of funny, but Hercules has a joke per minute ratio so persistent it almost works against the film, and frankly you'd never guess that about the movie just by playing through this game. And if Deep Jungle is a world that ended up kinda unremarkable for just how much of the movie was lost in translation, then the Coliseum finds a decent way around that problem by making itself the most unique world structurally. For as much as I absolutely adore KH3's Olympus, I truly did miss having a proper tournament world. There's just something compelling about making your way through ranks of increasingly powerful enemies and bosses, and as far as villain plans in this game, Hades setting you up to eventually face Cloud Strife acting as the Lord of the Dead's personal hitman is a really clever way to build tension. Heck, the appearance of Cloud here all on its own probably kicks this world up several notches for FF7 fans. That Cloud, Strife, and Hades of all characters actively interact and play complementary roles in the plot really captures the inherent magic of a Disney Final Fantasy crossover that you'd otherwise only get from Donald and Goofy. It's such a bizarre prospect on its face that you could only ever get from this game, and seeing the fast-talking, tempestuous Lord of the Dead bounce off this super self-serious hero is great stuff. Apropos of nothing, I also love this little animation of Phil freaking the heck out as Hercules fights Cerberus. Speaking of Hercules, being voiced by Sean Astin in this game and only this game will never not be weird. I'm not sure why Tate Donovan couldn't show up for this one, but Astin doesn't sound like him at all. That Herc's characterization is thinnest in this game also doesn't help. Not to say he's utilized poorly. Having a Hercules at the end of his film arc who can stand as a heroic ideal which can serve to foil both Sora and Cloud is really cool, as is just using this world to talk about what being a hero really means to these characters. The bookends of this world's story, where Sora goes from thinking that being a hero is just fighting a bunch of monsters, to claiming that what really makes him a hero is the strength of his friendships, is the closest this game gets to giving him a fully formed arc over the course of a single world. Though the fact that the game encourages you to fight each tournament as it's unlocked means that that arc also ends up serving as a kind of concurrent backbone to the rest of the adventure, and that sense of growth is reflected in each of the tournaments. Getting to fight Yuffie, Leon, Cloud, and especially Leon and Cloud together, that's some great stuff. Even if Yuffie threatens to ruin it by healing herself like 4 or 5 times in one fight, only I get to do that. Main character privilege. For first-time players, the Leon-Yuffie fight in particular has got to be such a nice surprise. There's zero build-up to it, literally no indication that the pair of them will even be a part of this world, and for the many players who likely had their big banana shoes handed to them on a silver gunblade back in Traverse Town, beating Leon is such a great mark of progress that I wish it were commemorated by a cutscene that featured the pair admitting defeat. I can't even imagine how satisfying and amazing this must have felt if you were already a fan of these characters beforehand. Sora getting to beat Leon, Cloud, and Sephiroth must have felt like the ludonarrative equivalent of cementing his place in the pantheon of video game protags. Given that it's his world, I wish the Hercules fight was better, though I admire the staunch adherence of his moveset to moves that he actually pulled off in the film. The whole mechanic of him going invincible until you hit him with a barrel just feels super arbitrary though, and having him stop and pose to give you opportunities to hit him is just stupid. At least it's a better fight than the downright pathetic Rock Titan. To this day, I've never beaten Ice Titan or Sephiroth, but they're cool too. This is another one of those worlds that just sets out to be something very specific and then pulls off that specific thing super well. In a game full of worlds that cut large swaths out of their source material, this is an example that's maybe the most egregious. Not adapting the Christmas half of The Nightmare Before Christmas until the second game is a really interesting choice that highlights just how engaging Halloweentown is as a setting all on its own. I really appreciate how unique the story of this world feels relative to the rest of the game. When you step back and look at what happens here, even though Oogie Boogie has a place on Maleficent's council, his role here just extends to being Halloweentown's local troublemaker, who steals a science experiment and ruins a town celebration early into the planning stages and then gets massacred for his trouble. Nothing of great importance to the wider story actually happens here, punctuated by the fact that Jack Skellington apparently learned absolutely nothing from the experience. But it's thematically appropriate in that we have a bunch of characters sitting around and actually contemplating what a heart even is for the first time in the game. It's also just the most natural thing in the world for characters that so value fear and gruesomeness to try and utilize the Heartless. I think it's really smart. The outside of Boogie's Manor is a spectacular room. Just this giant, creepy tower crawling with Heartless that seems to be kind of alive even before Oogie himself gets fused into the building. It's one of the locations where you really have to be careful and get strategic, since so many of the Heartless here are the kind that fly or jump around a whole bunch, and one wrong move can send you tumbling from the super high place that you need to be all the way to the ground. Fighting Lock, Shock, and Barrel makes for a fun little mini-boss, Spooks of Halloweentown is a great battle theme, Sora, Donald, and Goofy's costumes are really something, and I like this really funny line from Oogie Boogie.
Ooh, when I get my hands on that, well, I've got no hands.
Oogie himself is a really interesting boss fight mechanically. Of all the bosses in the game, it's the one least conducive to just blunt forcing your way through. The second phase here, where he takes over the manor, requires infinitely less strategy, but makes up for it in pure scale and atmosphere. Leaping from the top of a cliff to climb this giant misshapen monster house abomination and pop all his dark zits is just the coolest thing, especially once the house itself starts making moves to shake you off. It's really just an incredibly unique world, befitting an incredibly unique movie. As far as Disney worlds go, I think it's got the most memorable stuff that the game has to offer. And I hope you liked that extended tour of the Disney worlds, since from here on out we're talking all KH original locations, starting at the ending. By which of course I mean the end of the world. The sense of dread baked into every nook and cranny of this place is impressive. As soon as the characters arrive, you can see the whole foreboding expanse in front of you from the moment you disembark, before even the first cutscene. A scene which on its own sets up some tension for what'll happen to Sora and co once you beat the game. The giant crevasse is a great location design, and I also really love the volcanic crater, this collection of tiny, cramped rooms with the degraded, unrecognizable remains of other worlds sticking out of the walls. This is the world where the final boss takes place, along with my second favorite scene in the game, that being the actual ending. Everything from Kingdom Hearts' light to the actual end credits makes for what is, in my opinion, the most emotionally effective ending in the series to date. The entire simple and clean sequence doesn't quite bring tears to my eyes, but good gracious does it come close. The restoration of Destiny Islands and the rest of the worlds lost to darkness as Kairi watches on is just something that never gets old. Throughout the rest of the world, we get moments like the first real Kingdom Hearts title drop, which occurs in the world Terminus, as well as a boss fight against freaking Chernabog, which honestly feels like he should have been a secret boss given he has zero ties to Maleficent or Ansem. We get a cool sequence of mostly optional, modified versions of rooms from previous worlds for grinding and items, which is cool. I especially like the truncated version of Oogie Boogie's game room. Also, funny how much we commit to 100 Acre Wood being the no heartless allowed chill-out spot. I think this one stands out as far as final worlds in the series go, just in terms of sheer atmosphere and memorable visuals. Other games might have final worlds that feature more impactful cutscenes, but this one's aged phenomenally even with the competition. I've been working on this list for so long, dude, and it's taking all I have to not just start phoning it in now that we're in the home stretch. All that to say, I hope you don't mind that I don't have a particularly flowery, roundabout way of introducing Traverse Town. It's another one of those instantly iconic locales, the world that properly sets up the central stakes of the game by establishing Maleficent, a fun series of rooms to explore, and where some pretty memorable critical scenes or plot points take place. It's also the one where all the Final Fantasy characters hang out, if you're into that. Yeah, it should be more than obvious by now that I'm way keener on the Disney side of this franchise than I am on Final Fantasy. As it stands, my biggest exposure to the FF franchise is these games, FF7 Remake and FF7 Machine Abridged. But even for someone with no real attachment to Leon, Yuffie, Aerith, or Cid going into the game, their presence really does lend something nice. If nothing else, that first fight with Leon leaves a heck of an impression, the first legitimate fight in the game against an intelligent opponent that's not literally duking it out by playground rules. As the game's hub world, Traverse is the only one you revisit consistently, but it's really the first and second visits that I want to hone in on. Firstly, Traverse Town's just fascinating to me as a concept, one of those ideas that immediately hooks me into the fiction of the series. A world where refugees of other worlds end up when their home is lost to darkness, a place that only comes into existence at all when such a situation arises. Though I will say it's a little ironic to have this world so high when it can sometimes share a problem that the bottom entry has, namely the lack of direction. It's notoriously annoying how the first visit to Traverse Town is really unclear about specific things you need to do to progress the story. Hard to be too mad at it though, since it's a very cozy world, or I guess in Yuffie's words, it's very nice and snug. The Traverse Town theme is the perfect music to relax to in a cafe, and hand in hand would be a perfect battle theme even if it wasn't basically turned into the definitive theme for Sora, Donald, and Goofy. This is the world where we really get our mission laid out for us, and the world where we learn that Maleficent has her hooks in Riku, thus setting up the tension for his and Sora's friendship falling apart. The scene right before that point in the second visit, where Sora and Riku find each other, is also one of the most layered character interactions in the game. Hilarious thing that I only just learned on this playthrough, you can enter the hotel during the reverse armor fight and the game will just let you. It's not even the only boss fight that lets you do that, but it sticks out so particularly funny to me here. Like, the boss will patiently wait outside and presumably chug some potions while you time out in the middle of the fight to hang out in a bed and breakfast. Very useful if you're like me and find yourself wanting to restock on items or switch keyblades mid-fight. This world also sets you up to find the lost Dalmatian puppies, who are adorable and make for probably the best collectible / side quest in the series. It really is a shame that this place just stops existing at the end of the game, because I'd have loved to see future games expand on it in their own style. I mean, yeah, there's Dream Drop Distance, but Say, let me know in the comments if I should get around to Triple D after I rank KH2. let's be real everyone, this was the obvious number one. Every other world was just gunning for second place this whole time. The very instant you land in the middle of this reversing, parted ocean, you know Hollow Bastion is someplace special. The end of the world is the final destination in the game, but Hollow Bastion is what really feels like the climax. As soon as you arrive, the game starts dramatically paying off all of the central relationships and conflicts built to throughout so far. Riku taking the Keyblade as Donald and Goofy follow his lead a moment later is such an effective low point for Sora and the player. And the moment where Sora goes from despairing over that to determination in teaming up with Beast is a really great cutscene. There's very few instances of gameplay and story integration I can think of more effective than Sora being completely useless against Heartless during the first stretch of this world. It's a length of gameplay that goes on just long enough for the feeling of powerlessness to fully set in, before reuniting with Donald and Goofy and ganging up on Riku in an incredibly cathartic rematch. That catharsis is really all that fight is about, a comparatively easy but well-won climax to this little mini-arc before the world really turns the screws on you. Because of all that, Beast is by necessity the best party member in the game, and it's so cool that even the very idea of Disney party members climaxes with this stage. Everything really has just been escalated here. The game might encourage you to take a second to go back and explore the other worlds one last time between the first and second Hollow Bastion visits, but emotionally, even just the first visit feels like the denouement of the game has well and truly started. I made a similar point in my KH3 video when I talked about how Keyblade Graveyard is where you accomplish the goals you set out with at the start of the game, even though it's not the last world, and the same is largely true of Hollow Bastion. It's here where you finally save Kairi, beat Maleficent, and free the princesses. And there's still things to be resolved afterward, but those are all stakes that only become clear once you've already landed. There's a version of Kingdom Hearts out there in the multiverse where Maleficent really is the final boss and the game ends with the events of Visit 1, and the Kingdom Hearts of that reality is still an incredibly satisfying and complete experience, because that's just how hard Visit 1 of Hollow Bastion goes. It's to the point that no matter how many times I play this game, I always think of HB as the last world, quote-unquote. Speaking of Maleficent, you know what's a really good bit of game design? Introducing a ton of chests that you can only access with the gravity spell, prepping you for how much you're going to want to use that when fighting the evil fairy. Said boss fight is admittedly a bit of a pushover, but I still think it's pretty fun, and Dragon Maleficent is really cool and challenging to compensate. The Grand Hall is probably my favorite room in this world, maybe my favorite room in the game for its story relevance. It's where the Riku rematch and that ensuing big emotional climax take place, with the super memorable set piece of the multicolored Kingdom Hearts logo serving the same purpose for that fight as the keyhole did for the Jafar boss. It's where Sora finally learns that he's got Kairi's heart inside him and stabs himself in the dang chest to wake her up in what I consider the game's most memorable and impactful cutscene. Sora giving that last little peaceful smile before he conks out legit gives me chills. The room also has another incredibly memorable set-piece visual in the form of the comatose princesses all lined up against the walls. Especially if you're someone with a big attachment to those characters from their movies, seeing Snow White, Alice, Jasmine, Aurora, Cinderella, and Belle all imprisoned in this eerie blue lighting, lined up like sacrifices, is downright haunting stuff, and immediately brings the mood down from whatever high you might have been feeling after beating Maleficent. The brief stretch of gameplay after Sora's sacrifice where you roam around as a Heartless is a great way to throw the player off and really sell them on the magnitude of Sora's choice, conveying the feeling of confusion and helplessness way better than just more cutscene would. Kairi being the one to bring Sora back is also really cute and sweet. Aesthetically, this world is definitely my favorite and the most memorable of the original locales in the game. It's this very dank, foreboding place, not enough to feel out of step with the rest of the game's locations, but the only remotely inviting room in the castle is the library. There's also something really cool about the idea that you are in fact storming this castle, working your way in from outside, through all of the guards and gates, and then slowly worming your way into the heart of the building. I don't know, I just think that's a really cool premise that other games would reutilize. Also, Scherzo di Notte is without question the game's best battle theme, period. Knowing that this world is the original home of the Final Fantasy characters usurped and corrupted by Maleficent makes it very cathartic to see them get back here, and it definitely feels like a world they belong in. Speaking of aesthetics, The Heartless that show up here are among my favorite designs, a lot more intimidating and demonic looking than any enemies in the worlds previous. The Defender in particular is a really inspired design that I love. I don't know, I feel like I'm kinda petering out here compared to how I ended the last video, but I just really appreciate how cool and cathartic and memorable this world is, choosing to be the big thing the game builds up to while also managing to juggle a role as prologue to the true ending. As I said up top, I know that other people's lists are likely going to be different from my own, so why don't you give me your thoughts on my world ranking as well as a ranking of your own down in the comments. Like and subscribe if you're into that. Meanwhile, I'm gonna rest my throat for a while and start playing some Cage 2. Deuces.